6 hunters came to take me and my wife back to slavery with fraudulent warrants. I killed 2 of them with river stones, wounded 4 others. All of them left without us. I was a free man with legitimate freedom papers. Purchased my release in 1847. Built a cabin in Pennsylvania. Lived quietly for 4 years. They came anyway. Counted us aloud, like property. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I had 12 smooth stones in a leather pouch. Had learned accuracy as a boy hunting birds for food. 15 years of practice. Thousands of releases. The pursuit lasted 4 hours in dense woods. I used terrain and stone angles. Picked them off one by one as they separated through the trees. 2 died from their injuries within a week. Murder warrants were issued. Federal charges. Rewards posted dead or alive. I fled to Canada and never returned. The official record calls me a fugitive who killed law-abiding men. But the Henderson family in Virginia never actually owned us. Our papers were legitimate. The warrants were fraudulent. The hunters were criminals carrying legal documents. I defended myself against kidnapping. The law called it murder. The question is not whether I was justified. I was. The question is, how many other free black people were seized on fraudulent warrants? And how many of them fought back but never survived to testify? The hunters arrived before noon on a Tuesday in October 1851. 6 men on horseback with dogs, straining at leather leads. They rode into the clearing where my wife and I were harvesting late squash and counting aloud as they approached. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Being counted before seizure was familiar. I had been counted this way twice before in my life. Once at an auction in Virginia when I was 12, once at a property division when I was 19, and an estate was split between brothers who could not agree on ownership. Counting meant they were preparing documentation. Making sure the numbers would match the warrants they carried, I placed my wife behind the tree line with a gesture she understood immediately. She moved without sound, carrying the harvest basket, disappearing into the pines that bordered the eastern edge of our small plot. We were not enslaved anymore. We had purchased our freedom 4 years earlier, in 1847, and moved to this isolated land in western Pennsylvania. But freedom on paper did not always mean freedom in practice when men with warrants and weapons decided otherwise. The captain dismounted. He was a thick man with a gray beard and a marshal's badge pinned to his coat. He unfolded papers from his saddlebag and read them aloud as facts rather than questions. Warrant for the arrest and return of 2 fugitives from service. Male Negro, approximately 35 years of age. Female Negro, approximately 30 years of age. Property of Henderson Estate, Loudoun County, Virginia. We are not fugitives, I said. We purchased our freedom. I have papers. Papers can be forged, the captain said. You will come with us for verification. If your papers are legitimate, you will be released. This was a lie we both knew. Verification would happen in Virginia, where the Henderson family could claim us, regardless of documentation. Free papers meant nothing when the people examining them had financial interest in declaring them false. The dogs strained harder, pulling toward the tree line where my wife had gone. They had learned her scent already. The captain gestured toward the woods. We know there are 2 of you. Bring her out, and this goes easier. She is not here. The dogs say different. I had learned as a boy that the first moments of confrontation determined everything that followed. If you complied immediately, you surrendered all leverage. If you resisted stupidly, you were killed. The path between these outcomes was narrow and required careful calculation. I will come with you, I said, but I need to secure my property first. The chickens need to be penned. The squash needs to be stored. Give me 20 minutes. The captain considered this. He was confident in his numbers and his weapons. 20 minutes seemed harmless. 10 minutes, he said. Then we leave with or without your cooperation. I nodded and moved toward the small cabin we had built. The hunters dismounted. 2 of them lit pipes. The dogs were tied to trees at the clearing's edge. I went into the cabin and collected what I needed. Not freedom papers, those would not save us now. Not money, they would simply take it. I collected the leather pouch I kept hidden under the floorboards. The pouch contained 12 smooth river stones. each one carefully selected over years for weight and balance. I had learned stone balance as a boy in Virginia. An old man named Samuel, who had been born in a country he called home, though he could never return to it, had taught me. He showed me how to find stones that fit the hand, how to feel for the weight distribution, how to practice release until the motion became instinct. Birds for food, he had said, but the skill works on anything that needs hitting from distance. I had hunted birds with stones for 15 years, had fed myself and others through lean seasons when ammunition was too expensive or forbidden, had developed accuracy that seemed impossible to those who had not practiced thousands of releases. I put the pouch in my coat pocket and returned to the clearing. The captain looked at his pocket watch. "Time is up." "Where is the woman?" "I told you, she is not here." "Then we will find her ourselves. Boys, take the dogs into the woods. Bring her back." This was the moment I had calculated toward. 6 men in a clearing were dangerous. 6 men, scattered in dense forests, with limited visibility, were vulnerable. I moved toward the tree line myself, ahead of the hunters. "I will help you search. I know these woods better than your dogs." The captain nodded. He wanted this finished quickly. He divided his men into pairs and sent them in 3 directions, northeast and south. He kept himself and 1 other man at the cabin. The pursuit began as the paired hunters moved into the pines with dogs pulling them forward. I chose higher ground rather than distance. I moved up the slope toward the ridge that overlooked the valley. The terrain there was rocky and steep, difficult for dogs and horses, but I knew every stone and root and gap. Had walked this land for 4 years in all seasons. The men split confidently into their assigned directions. They were hunting runaway slaves, which they had done before. They knew the pattern pursuit until exhaustion, capture, return. They had weapons and numbers and legal authority. What they did not have was knowledge of this specific ground, or understanding that I was not running. I was hunting birds by separating the flock. I slowed my pace deliberately, moving just fast enough to stay ahead of the closest pair, but not so fast that I disappeared. I wanted them to believe they were gaining ground, wanted them to commit to the pursuit. Some replaced sight as the primary sense in dense woods. I could hear them crashing through undergrowth behind me, could hear their breathing getting heavier as the slope increased, could hear the dogs baying with excitement. I felt the weight of stones in my pouch, tested one in my hand. Smooth river granite, slightly ovale, maybe 3 ounces. Perfect balance. I had learned as a boy that angles mattered more than distance, that waiting for the right moment mattered more than rushing the release, that breath control determined accuracy. The first pair of hunters closed in. I could see them through the trees now, maybe 40 yards back. One was younger, lean and fast. The other was older, heavier, moving more carefully. I positioned myself behind a thick oak and waited, controlled my breathing, let my heart rate slow. Despite the situation, a hunter stepped into a small clearing below my position. The younger one, careless, with confidence. He scanned the woods ahead but not above. His rifle was in his hands but not raised. I had learned waiting for wings to pause before release. Birds in flight were nearly impossible to hit. Birds that landed for a moment, that settled into stillness, became targets. The hunter paused to catch his breath, stood still in the clearing, looking east, where he thought I had gone. I held the stone loosely in my right hand, extended my left arm toward the target, felt the weight settle into the familiar grip. My breath steadied completely. The forest sounds faded. There was only the target and the stone and the release point. Impact broke the pattern of pursuit. The stone struck the hunter's temple with a sound like a hammer on wood. He dropped instantly, rifle falling from his hands. His body hit the ground and did not rise. Shouts erupted from somewhere west, the older hunter calling for his partner, other voices answering from different directions. Panic was turning organized lines into scattered gaps. I relocated immediately before they could triangulate my position, moved north along the ridge, using the rocky terrain to avoid leaving clear tracks. The dogs lost certainty. I could hear their baying change, from focused pursuit to confused circling. They had been following scent on the ground, but I was above them now, and wind carried scent away from their position. The captain's voice cut through the forest, hoarse and angry. Regroup, fall back to the clearing. But commands failed when terrain disagreed with tactics. The hunters were separated by dense woods and steep slopes. Regrouping would take time they did not have while I maintained elevation and knowledge of ground. I kept moving along the ridge, staying in shadow beneath the canopy. Below me I could see my wife signaling from cover near the creek bed. She was unharmed and positioned exactly where we had planned if pursuit came. We had discussed this possibility many times, had prepared routes and signals and contingency plans. Freedom on paper meant nothing without plans for defending it when paper failed. I changed my route to draw attention away from her position, moved west instead of north, making noise deliberately, breaking branches, disturbing leaves, creating a trail that pointed away from where she hid. The hunt fragmented further as hunters responded to sounds from multiple directions. They were no longer pursuing a plan. They were reacting to chaos. 2 hunters advanced along the creek bed below the ridge. They moved more carefully now, rifles ready, scanning the slopes above them. They had learned that this was not a simple pursuit. I had been taught stone skipping by the same elder who taught targeting. The principle was the same angle of release, determined distance and impact. Wada taught you to see the invisible path between hand and target. I used the water noise to mask my release. The creek was running high from recent rain, loud enough to cover small sounds. The stone hit the lead hunter in the shoulder. Not a killing blow, but enough to spin him sideways into his partner. Both men fell into the shallow water, rifles splashing out of reach. Silence followed the impact, then shouting, then the sound of men helping each other out of the creek and retreating downstream. Another pair of hunters fired blindly into brush west of my position. They could not see me, but were shooting at sound, or shadow, or fear. I remembered birds flushing from gunshots, scattering in panic. The lesson was to remain still until the danger revealed its ignorance. Blind fire showed the shooter did not know where the target was. I remained motionless behind a fallen log until the echoes faded. Then I moved again, changing position while they reloaded. Distance opened between us again. I was controlling the pace and the space. They were responding to my choices rather than executing their plan. The dogs circled without direction now. I could hear them baying in confusion, pulling their handlers in different directions. Wind had done what I needed it to, dew broken the scent trail into fragments. I had learned wind lessons from trapping rabbits. Wind carried scent in predictable patterns if you understood the terrain. Ridges created updrafts. Valleys funneled air downward. Water complicated everything. I crossed against the breeze deliberately, moving from south to north along the ridge where wind would carry my scent away from the dogs below. The scent trail thinned and vanished from their perception. One hunter tried to climb toward my position, exposing himself on open rock. He was trying to gain elevation advantage, perhaps thinking the same thoughts I had thought earlier, but he did not know the terrain, did not see the loose scree on the slope he was climbing, did not understand that angles mattered more than force when using stones. I waited for his balance to shift as he reached for a handhold, waited for the moment when both his hands were committed to climbing and his attention was focused upward rather than outward. The stone caught him in the chest, not enough to kill, but enough to break his grip. He slid backward down the rocky slope, unable to stop himself, tumbling 20 feet before crashing into the trees at the bottom. The count was dropping. 6 hunters had become 4, then 3. The captain's voice again, hoarse now with something that sounded like fear. Fall back, all of you! Fall back to the horses. Authority was unraveling under time and terrain and losses. The organized capture party was becoming a retreat. I moved laterally along the ridge, unseen, watching them gather in the clearing below. I could see the captain gesturing angrily, could see the remaining hunters looking at the woods with new wariness. Fear was replacing their plan. 2 of them were injured enough to need help walking. One had blood running down his face from the temple strike. Another held his shoulder at an unnatural angle. They'd come to capture 2 fugitives. They were leaving with 3 wounded and no prisoners. A lone hunter searched the ridge one final time, separated from the others by pride or orders or desperation. I watched him move through the trees below me, rifle ready, eyes scanning. Single targets were always easiest. No one to provide covering fire. No one to call for help. Just one man, alone, in unfamiliar woods. I chose concealment over speed, remaining perfectly still as he passed within 15 yards of my position. He was looking ahead, not checking his flanks or his back trail. The stone hit the back of his head. He fell forward without a sound and did not move again. Another silence settled over the woods. This one felt different, heavier. I counted the remaining voices from the clearing. Only two, the captain and one other man, calling for hunters who would not answer. I had learned counting down during summer storms as a child. The space between lightning and thunder told you how close danger was. The shrinking count meant danger was approaching. But now the count was shrinking in reverse. The danger was retreating. I moved closer to the clearing's edge, staying in dense shadow. I could see the captain standing near his horse, scanning the woods with the other hunter was helping wounded men onto horses. The captain stood exposed, silhouetted against the autumn sky. He was trying to project authority and control, trying to prove he was not afraid. But he was alone now except for one frightened man and 3 wounded ones. His capture party had been broken. His plan had failed. I waited for the final stillness, the moment when he stopped scanning and lowered the spyglass. When his attention fixed on one direction and his body became a statue, the release was clean. The stone struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He dropped the spyglass and stumbled against his horse. The last hunter helped him mount. They left quickly, abandoning the search, abandoning the dogs, abandoning any pretense that this had been a successful operation. The woods went quiet in a way that felt complete. The pursuit had ended, but I remained still for a long time, listening, making sure the quiet was real, that this was not a trap or a regrouping. My wife emerged from her hiding place near the creek. She looked up at the ridge where I stood. Our eyes met across the distance. We had survived, but we both knew what this meant. We could not stay here. The hunters would return with more men and better plans. Or they would send word to other marshals. Or they would simply burn us out from a safe distance. We had won this confrontation, but we had revealed ourselves in winning, had shown that we would fight back, had proven that free papers were not enough when the system decided to ignore them. I climbed down from the ridge slowly. My hands were shaking now that this stillness had released me. The stones felt heavier in my pouch than they had during the pursuit. My wife met me at the clearing's edge. She did not ask if I was hurt. She asked the only question that mattered. How many? 6 came, I said. 6 left. Some walking, some carried. She nodded. We have to leave tonight. I know. We gathered what we could carry, left everything else. The cabin we had built, the land we had cleared, the small garden we had planted, the chickens and tools and carefully accumulated possessions that represented 4 years of free labor and free choices. All of it abandoned because freedom on paper did not protect against men with weapons and warrants and the conviction that we were still property regardless of documentation. We walked north through the night, following paths I had scouted for this exact possibility. My wife carried food and blankets. I carried the stone pouch and the knowledge that I had just killed or wounded 6 men. The weight of that knowledge sat differently than I'd expected. I felt no regret for defending us, but I felt the enormity of what it meant. I had stopped being someone who survived through compliance and careful navigation of power structures. I had become someone who fought back with lethal force. There was no returning from that crossing. Word count, 3,058 words. I need to continue to reach approximately 4,000 words. Continuing part 1. We walked through the night, without speaking, conserving breath for the steep terrain. The forest was dark under cloud cover, the kind of darkness that made every step a negotiation between memory and touch. My wife moved ahead of me on familiar paths we had walked dozens of times in preparation for exactly this emergency. We had cached supplies at 3 different locations within a day's walk. Food, blankets, basic tools. We had mapped routes that avoided main roads and settlements. Freedom had required this planning. had required accepting that legal status might not protect us, that we might need to run again, even after purchasing our release from bondage. We reached the first cache just before dawn, a hollow beneath a split oak tree, 3 miles north of our abandoned cabin. Inside the hollowed space, we found the oilcloth bundle we had hidden 6 months earlier, dried meat, hardtack, a wool blanket, 20 feet of rope, a small hatchet, the supplies of people who knew that safety was temporary and preparation was survival. My wife unwrapped the bundle and distributed the food. We ate quickly, standing in the pre-dawn gray, watching the back trail for pursuit. "They will return," she said. "Today or tomorrow, with more men. I know. We can never come back here." This was the cost becoming visible. Not just the physical property we had abandoned, but the future we had imagined. The permanent settlement. The gradual accumulation of safety through time and legitimacy. All of it erased by 6 men with warrants and the conviction that our freedom papers were forgeries. "We will find somewhere else," I said. "Where, if they can come for us here, they can come for us anywhere." She was right. The problem was not geographic. The problem was systemic. As long as the Fugitive Slave Act gave bounty hunters legal authority to seize black people on suspicion, no place was safe. Papers were only as secure as the willingness of white authorities to honor them, and we had just proven that we would resist with force. That made us dangerous in a different way. Not just fugitives to be captured, but threats to be eliminated. "We keep moving," I said. "North to Canada if necessary. Somewhere the American law does not reach." She nodded slowly. Canada meant months of travel, meant leaving behind even the possibility of legal recognition. But it also meant true distance from the system that claimed ownership of people. We rested for 2 hours as the sun rose. Then we continued north, avoiding the roads, following ridgelines and creek beds that provided natural cover. By midday, we heard them, distant sounds of dogs and horses moving through the valley below us. The captain had returned, as we knew he would, with reinforcements. I counted voices when the wind shifted right. At least 12 men, maybe more. They were searching the cabin and the immediate area. We were already 5 miles ahead of them, moving through terrain where horses could not easily follow. But dogs could follow, and 12 men could spread wide enough to cover more ground than 6 had covered. I looked at my wife. "We need to break the trail completely." The creek crossing we scouted. She understood immediately. 3 miles ahead was a wide creek that ran fast over smooth rocks. Water eliminated scent. Smooth rocks eliminated tracks. If we crossed carefully and traveled downstream for a mile before exiting, the dogs would lose us. We moved faster, pushing through exhaustion. Reached the creek by mid-afternoon. The water was waist-deep and cold enough to steal breath. We crossed, holding hands to maintain balance against the current. Then we turned downstream and walked through the water for over a mile, letting the current erase our presence. When we finally exited onto a graveled bank, we took care to leave no clear footprints, stepped only on rocks, moved through undergrowth that would spring back and hide our passage. Behind us, faintly, we could hear the dogs baying in confusion at the creek bang, heard men shouting, heard the sounds of a pursuit that had lost its trail. We kept moving until dark, made no fire. Achi cold food slept in shifts with one person always listening. The next morning the sounds of pursuit were gone. Either they had given up or they were searching in the wrong direction. We continued north for 3 more days, using the remaining caches, moving only during hours when we could see clearly enough to avoid leaving obvious signs. On the 4th day we reached a settlement of free black families who had established a small community in the hills. People who knew what it meant to live with legal freedom but constant danger. They gave us food and shelter, asked no questions about why we were traveling or what we were running from. The unspoken rule of such communities was that everyone had a story, and those stories did not need to be shared to earn assistance. We stayed for 2 weeks, recovering strength and making plans. The community elder, a man named Thomas, who had purchased his freedom 20 years earlier, spoke to us plainly about our situation. "You killed white men?" he said. It was not a question. I defended myself and my wife from kidnappers. The law will not see it that way. The law will see a Negro who killed white men. That is a killing offense, regardless of circumstances. So I should have let him take us. I am not saying that. I am saying you need to understand what you have become. You are not just a free man anymore. You are a fugitive from justice, and that changes everything. He was right. I had crossed a line that could not be Even if I could prove the hunters were trying to kidnap us illegally, even if I could show my freedom papers were legitimate, I had still killed white men in resistance. That was unforgivable in the eyes of the law. What would you do? I asked. I would go to Canada. I would disappear into a place where American law cannot reach you, and I would never come back. My wife and I discussed this through the night. Canada meant permanent exile, meant accepting that we could never return to the country where we had been born, meant building a new life in a foreign place. But staying meant living with constant fear of recapture or execution, meant looking over our shoulders every day for the rest of our lives. I cannot live like that, my wife said. Always afraid, always running. I would rather start over somewhere new than spend decades waiting for them to find us. I agreed. We would go to Canada. Thomas arranged passage with a guide who knew the routes. We left the settlement at the end of October, joining a small group of other freedom seekers, making the same journey. The trip took 6 weeks. We walked most of it, traveling at night, hiding during the day. The guide was an older black man who had made this journey 11 times before. He knew where it was safe to rest, knew which white families would shelter runaways and which would turn us in for bounty money. We crossed into Canada in early December 1851, walking across a frozen river at dawn. The guide pointed to the far bank and said simply, "That is freedom." We settled in a small town north of Toronto, found work, built a cabin, started again. But I carried the weight of those 6 men, carried the knowledge of what I had done to defend our freedom. Some nights I could still feel the stones in my hand, could still see the hunters falling, could still hear the sounds of impact and the silence that followed. I had survived through violence, had chosen to fight rather than submit, had valued my freedom and my wife's freedom more than the hunters' lives. I did not regret this choice, but I understood its weight. I had learned something irreversible. That October day when hunters came counting, I had learned that compliance had limits, that legal freedom meant nothing without the willingness to defend it with force. I had learned that the system would come for us regardless of papers or purchase or legitimacy, and I had learned that I would kill rather than submit to re-enslavement. That knowledge changed me, made me someone different than I had been before. I was no longer just a freed man trying to build a quiet life. I was someone who had fought back and won. The full count became clear in the months after we reached Canada. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. A letter arrived in March 1852 from Thomas, the settlement elder who had helped us escape. He wrote carefully, using names that could not be traced, but the information was clear. 6 hunters had returned to Pennsylvania after pursuing us. 3 were wounded seriously enough to require extended medical care. 2 had died from their injuries within the week. The 6th, the captain, had survived, but lost the use of his right arm. 2 made dead. 4 men wounded or maimed, all from river stones, thrown by a fugitive Negro who refused capture. The letter continued with news that warrants had been issued, murder charges, federal crimes under the Fugitive Slave Act, rewards posted for information leading to our capture, dead or alive you. You can never return, Thomas wrote. Not to Pennsylvania, not to any American territory. They will hang you if they find you. I read the letter twice and then burned it. My wife watched the paper turn to ash in our small stove. 2 dead, she said quietly. 2 who came to kidnap us, I replied. 2 who would have dragged us back to slavery. I know, but they are still dead, and their families will want justice. Justice? The word felt strange applied to our situation. Was there justice in men coming to steal our freedom? Was there justice in a law that valued property rights over human rights? Was there justice in a system that made our self-defense into murder? But she was right about one thing. The families of dead hunters would want revenge, and the law would give it to them if we were ever found. The hidden truth emerged slowly over the next year through fragments of news and letters from people who had known us in Pennsylvania. The Henderson family in Virginia had never actually owned us. Our freedom papers were legitimate and had been verified before we left Virginia. But the family had sold our names to bounty hunters, as suspected fugitives anyway. Knowing the hunters would seize us first and verify later, it was a common scheme. Property owners would claim that free black people were actually fugitive slaves from their estates, would provide false documentation to bounty hunters, would profit from the recapture whether the claim was true or not. The hunters who came for us had been operating on false information. They were not pursuing actual fugitives. They were pursuing free people whose names had been sold for bounty money. We had been legal targets of an illegal operation, had been free people attacked by criminals who carried legal warrants based on fraudulent claims. And because I had defended us, because I had killed men who were trying to kidnap us, I was now a fugitive from justice. The system's flaw was fully exposed in this contradiction. Free black people had no protection under law. Freedom papers could be declared fraudulent by anyone with an economic interest in making that declaration. Self-defense against kidnapping was treated as murder if the victim was black and the kidnappers were white. The law created the conditions for the crime and then punished the victims for resisting. This was not an accident or an oversight. This was the design. The human cost became clearer as we built our life in Canada. We were safe from American law, but we were not safe from memory. My wife had nightmares about the dogs, would wake gasping, certain she could hear them baying outside our cabin. It took months before she could sleep through a full night without panic. I had different costs. My hands remembered the weight of stones, the specific balance of each one, the moment of release, the sound of impact. Some mornings I would wake with my right hand curled as if holding a stone. My shoulder would be tight from phantom throws. My mind would replay the angles and releases. I had killed 2 men and wounded 4 others. The mechanics of it had become muscle memory, and muscle memory did not care about justification or context. It simply repeated the pattern. We did not speak of this often. What was there to say? We had survived. Others had not. The moral weight of that fact sat between us like a third presence in our small cabin. Other fugitives who reached Canada told similar stories. A man from Kentucky who had fought off slave catchers with a knife, killing one. A woman from Maryland who had pushed a pursuing overseer off a cliff. A family from North Carolina whose father had shot a bounty hunter who broke into their home. All of them carrying the weight of violence they had not chosen, but had been forced to deploy. All of them legal fugitives because they had refused illegal seizure. The count was never written in official records. No accounting was made of how many free black people defended themselves against kidnapping. No ledger tracked the deaths of bounty hunters killed while pursuing fraudulent claims. The official story was always the same. Dangerous fugitive Negroes killing law-abiding white men. The context was always erased. The fraudulent warrants were never mentioned. The verified freedom papers were always declared suspicious. Truth died in the official records, only survived in the testimonies of people like me, speaking carefully to audiences who might believe or might not. I spoke to other fugitives in Canada about that October day, told the story without embellishment, described the pursuit, the terrain, the stones, the outcomes. Some people understood immediately, saw it as legitimate defense against kidnapping, saw the dead hunters as criminals who suffered the consequences of their crime. Others were uncomfortable with the violence, regardless of context, believed that resistance, even justified resistance, only provoked worse retaliation, that we should have submitted to capture and tried to prove our freedom through legal channels. But legal channels required access to lawyers we could not afford, required appearing before judges who were economically and socially aligned with slave owners, required believing that a system built on slavery would suddenly protect black people's rights when those rights conflicted with white people's property claims. I had tried legal channels, had purchased freedom legally, had obtained legitimate papers, had lived quietly for 4 years without incident. And the system had come for me anyway with fraudulent warrants and armed men. So I had chosen survival over submission, had chosen stone over surrender, and I would make that choice again. The patrols avoided our ridge in Pennsylvania after that October. Thomas wrote to tell me this. In 1853, bounty hunters who had previously worked western Pennsylvania now operated in different territory. The story of what happened had spread and created wariness. They know someone up there kills hunters, Thomas wrote. They do not know it was you specifically, but they know the land is dangerous. So they hunt elsewhere. Fear was teaching boundaries that law would not enforce. The system relied on black people submitting to seizure without resistance. When resistance proved lethal, the calculus changed. The hunters found easier targets in people who would not fight back. This was how the system maintained itself through the threat of overwhelming force that made resistance seem hopeless. When resistance proved successful, the system adapted by going after softer targets rather than confronting the flaw in its own logic. My wife and I separated publicly in Canada to survive in different ways. This was a decision we made together in 1854. She wanted to teach, to work with children, to build community. But association with me endangered that work. My name was connected to the Pennsylvania killings. People knew or suspected who I was, so we pretended to separate. She took a teaching position in Toronto under her maiden name. I stayed in the northern settlement working as a carpenter under a different name. We saw each other privately, but maintained public distance. Protection through invisibility. We had learned this technique during slavery, and we applied it in freedom. The system could not target what it could not see or connect. Years compressed. 1,855, 1856, 1,857. We built separate lives that were actually one life maintained through deception and distance. The cost was loneliness. The benefit was survival. The land in Pennsylvania kept the truth. The ridge where I had fought the hunters. The clearing where they had counted us. The creek where we had broken the trail. That land remembered what the official records erased. The stones I had thrown remained somewhere in the forest. Evidence scattered across terrain that would never testify. I returned once, in 1859, 8 years after the pursuit, crossed the border illegally at night, traveled alone to the ridge, wanted to see if the truth was still visible in the landscape. The cabin was gone, burned or dismantled. I could not tell which. The clearing had grown over with new vegetation. The paths we had walked were disappearing under seasons of growth. But the ridge was unchanged. The rocks were the same. The slope was the same. The tree line was the same. I found 3 of the stones I had thrown, recognized them by weight and shape when I picked them up. They fit my hand the way they had fitted 8 years earlier. I buried them under the split oak where we had cached supplies, returned them to the land that had witnessed their use. Let the earth hold the evidence I could not speak about safely. The costs surfaced in unexpected moments, even years later. A sound like dogs bang wood frees me in place. The sight of men on horseback counting aloud would make my hand reach for stones that were not there. My body remembered survival. My mind remembered violence. The two were connected in ways I could not separate. I refused to tell the full details of what happened that October. To most people who asked, the mechanics of how I killed men with stones felt too much like instruction, like passing on technique rather than testifying to necessity. But I told enough to make the truth known. 6 hunters came, 6 hunters left, some walking, some carried. 2 died later. The pursuit failed because I fought back. That much needed to be said, needed to be recorded in testimony, if not in official documents, because the silence around black people's resistance served the system, made it seem like submission was the only option, made it seem like slavery and kidnapping were inevitable forces that could not be opposed. But they could be opposed. I was proof. Others like me were proof. We had fought back and survived. Not all avus, not most avus, but enough to prove that resistance was possible. The account narrows here because the details beyond this point are less important than the principle. I survived by fighting. My wife survived by my fighting. We made it to Canada. We built a new life. The men who came for us did not survive or did not survive whole. That was the cost they paid for attempting to kidnap free people. I speak now in 1865, 14 years after the pursuit. The Civil War has ended. Slavery has been abolished. The Fugitive Slave Act has been repealed. The legal structure that made me a fugitive for defending myself no longer exists. But the memory exists. The weight exists. The knowledge exists. I killed 2 men with river stones, wounded for others, defended my freedom, and my wife's freedom through calculated violence. I do not apologize for this, but I carry it. I speak it now, because the count was never written in official records, because the truth of what happened was erased from legal documents, because the story of black resistance was suppressed to maintain the myth of inevitable submission. But we did not submit. Not all of us. Not always. Some of us fought back with whatever weapons we had. Knives, stones, guns when we could get them, our hands when we had nothing else. And sometimes we won. Not often enough. Not most of the time. But sometimes I was one man on one ridge in one October. But I was part of a larger pattern of resistance that the system tried to hide. This is my testimony. This is what happened when 6 hunters came to steal our freedom. They counted us like property. We fought back like people. And we survived. The land keeps the truth. The stones remember. And I testify. The weight remains, but so does the freedom we defended. And that balance between cost and survival, between violence and liberation, between what was done and what was necessary, that balance is the burden I carry still. I speak it now so others might know. Resistance was possible. The cost was real, but submission had costs too. We chose to fight. We chose to survive. We chose freedom over capture, and I would choose it again.